All right, today we're going to discuss the age of discovery and Spanish exploration. We're going to begin our discovery by looking at Gary Nash's thesis on three worlds colliding. Gary Nash wrote a great book called Red, White, and Black. Very controversial book, but in this work, he suggested that what makes American culture unique is that it's shaped by the collisions of three basic cultures: the red culture, the American Indian; the white culture, the Europeans; and the black culture, the African culture. And that's kind of the direction that we're going to take as we look at this in the class. So let's start talking about the red culture first. I guess before we get into the details of the red culture, we need to know where these first Americans came from. If you look at your PowerPoint, that picture that you see there is a satellite picture of the Bering Strait, the area separating Alaska from Asia. And at one point, sometime between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, I know that we really narrowed that one down, but somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, we had a small ice age, and the water levels actually dropped. Think about whenever you freeze part of the water, that ice floats on top, and that's going to make the water level actually drop. Well, that's kind of what happens here. And there's this land bridge that connected Asia and the Americas. And over a period of time, these first Americans crossed, probably following a herd, and they settled in the Americas, particularly North and South America. And as we had more cooling spots, and this is going to freeze even worse, and it's going to push the people further and further down. So we're going to have Americans stretching all the way down to the tip of South America by the time we're through. So how do we even know about this idea of where the first Americans came from? Well, we first know about it from looking at mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA only comes down through the mother. So if you look at this, and if there's a match for somebody in Mongolia or Turkey and the Americas, there has to be some kind of a common ancestor there. So that's kind of a big deal. We also look at language, and we see commonalities in Indian words and some words in parts of Asia. We just kind of put these clues together. What we don't have is a good written record about it. So once these Americans arrived, they're going to quickly start to establish a bunch of different Indian nations. Now you'll notice I'm using the term nations and not tribes. Tribes is a very Eurocentric idea. It has this idea that somehow they're less sophisticated than Europeans, which simply wasn't true. These Indian nations, they had their own culture, they had their own language, and they stretched all the way across both continents, North and South America. The single most important thing to happen anywhere in the world was the Neolithic Revolution. This happened about the year 7000 BCE in North America, so about 7,000 years before the Common Era. That's about 9,000 years ago, if you're kind of doing the math in your mind. It happened earlier in other parts of the world and later in some others, but in North America about 7,000 BCE. The definition you need for the Neolithic Revolution is as follows. It's the shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. The shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. This is going to be important, because once people learned that they could tame the land, they no longer had to depend on following the herd or what they could gather seasonally. They didn't have to have a nomadic lifestyle anymore. Suddenly, they could have a settled lifestyle. They could build towns like this Incan village you see here in the background on this slide here. The llamas in the foreground looking over at this Incan village. This village is probably about 7,000 to 8,000 years old, and it still stands. Things like the hammer and pestle you see at the top left was a tool that they used to break down wheat in order to give the Americans more nutrients from it. That bottom bone, if you look at it, you can see where it was sharpened. That would have been strapped off to a stick and used as a scythe to cut down wheat and so forth. So the Neolithic Revolution is going to be incredibly important. You can't really have civilization until you have the Neolithic Revolution. All right, so I've told you that the first Americans came across the Bering Strait. So if you think about that, you've got to ask yourself, if they came across, how did we end up with so many different Indian nations? If it was one small gene pool, and why aren't they all up in Alaska and Canada and get less as you go south? So let's take a snapshot here. About 1492, there's about 12 million Native Americans living north of the modern Mexico-United States border, north of the Rio Grande. So the modern U.S., Canada, including Alaska, has about 12 million people, pretty small number. There's about 35 million between Mexico and the Isthmus of Panama, so what we would think of as Mexico and Central America, and about 60 million if you count all of South America and the Caribbean. Why would that be? Well, again, there was an intense cold period after this founding gene base got here, and it became intensely cold closer to the poles, and that pushed people closer and closer to the equator. They were able to survive more, they could reproduce more, and over time, they become a larger area. Why is that going to be important? Well, if you think about it, the English had a much easier time defeating the Indians than the Spanish did. Well, is it because the English were better fighters? Well, not really. It's because there were only about 12 million Indians in where the English settled. The Spanish settled, there's about 95 million people in that area. It's a big difference, okay? We're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some South American tribes for a minute here. I know this is a U.S. history class, but I think it's important to be able to compare. We have the Maya. The Maya Indians were located on the Yucatan Peninsula in what's today Mexico and Guatemala. They dominated an area about the size of the Roman Empire at its height. It was a large area. It was the single most advanced American society. And they're going to dominate this region for about 600 years, from about the year 300 to 900. If you think about that, the Roman Empire lasted about 200 years at its height. The British Empire, about 200 years at its height. Even the Russian Empire at its height was about 200 years. The U.S., we're not even at 200 years yet at our height. We're a little over 200 years old, period. And this society lasts 600 years. It's a pretty advanced society. I talk about this because I want to point out how smart they were. They had a highly accurate calendar. They'd come out and measured a year at 365 days and 6 hours, which is actually more correct than our calendar, if you think about it. We have to add a day every 4 years because of leap year, because our calendar is only 365 days. Our calendar is actually 6 hours short of accurate. And they did this with no modern tools. Quite an advanced society. If you move up a little bit into the Anahuac Valley, the Valley of Mexico, this is kind of where Mexico City is today. You had a group called the Toltecs. There is very little known about the Toltecs. They were a warlike people. We know that because we found graves, and we see repeatedly that the bones show signs of breaking in places that would be consistent with battle wounds. If they had a written language, they didn't leave any of it behind. They did leave some sculptures behind, such as this one you see in this PowerPoint, which, believe it or not, was a very controversial find when they found it, because it very closely resembles some African sculpture from the same time period, which has led some historians to suggest that the African kingdoms might have reached the Americas hundreds of years before Columbus. And again, their idea is this idea of cultural diffusion, that this sculpture, this art, is so similar there must have been a link. That is still a very controversial thought. But the idea is there. We know that the Toltec died as an empire sometime before the year 1215. We know this because they abandoned their capital city and they just kind of disappear. What we think happened, what we're pretty sure happened, is they got absorbed into other tribes. Particularly, the next one we're going to talk about is the Aztecs. Now, Aztec is a name that was put on them later on. They actually would have called themselves the Maya Indians. I know it's spelled Mexico, but you would have pronounced it Maya. That's actually where we get our name Mexico from. They immigrated from the north. These are the descendants of the mound builders. If you think about like Cahokia in Ohio with the beautiful snake mounds, or right here in East Texas we have the Caddoan mounds. Those guys were the descendants of these Aztecs that settled in Tenochtitlan, the old Toltec capital, in what is today Mexico City. Again, we know they're very warlike, largely from their own pictures. The picture you're seeing here is a colorized version of a picture that was found in Tenochtitlan. And what they've done here, the artist has taken this, it would have all been faded now, but he found scraps of the colors that at one point had painted it, and he came through and colorized this. So we can see probably what the people would have seen in the Aztec times. And we believe this is a sacrifice that the Aztecs made. Again, still not in North America, but very sophisticated. The Incas, they're down in Ecuador and Chile, down in South America. We believe these people to be the greatest architects of the ancient world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because, again, it's outside of our scope of reference. I just want you to be able to compare this with North America. These people built buildings thousands of years ago that still stand today. And they did this in volcano and earthquake territories. It's impressive. We know they had very advanced medicine at this time period. Some people say they had brain surgery. The reason they say this is because they found skulls with perfect squares cut out of them, which has led some people to believe that what they were doing was cutting the skull in order to allow inflammation to go down so people survived. We don't know that. Maybe they were just cutting a hole in the skull and digging around and there were sticks. We don't know. But there's some people that believe that. The Incas were a very advanced society. Now we're going to get into North American civilizations. They were much less sophisticated than the Central and South American ones. Generally, decentralized. What that means is we didn't have these large nations, Indian nations, that dominated vast swaths of area. Instead, we had many small Indian nations that were built around family units. And they were highly environmentally adapted. What that means is they would build their homes according to the environment they lived in. If you lived in an area with a lot of trees, you would build wigwams with bent reeds. If you lived up in the Pacific Northwest, you might build long houses. Or if you lived along the Great Lakes, these long log houses that were like dormitories. If you were on the Great Plains, you might live in these tents that we call teepees of stretched buffalo hide. If you lived in the American Southwest, you'd probably have adobe houses. This is all environmental adaptation. The first big group I want to talk about are the Northeast Woodlands Indians. These are the guys located in the area around the Great Lakes, stretching roughly from the Ohio Valley down to Chesapeake Bay, which is kind of Virginia, Maryland, right there on that border. Again, they lived in wigwams. That's a picture of a wigwam there at the top right. Very efficient houses. Or in these long houses. A long house was a large log house. It was kind of a barrack style, lived with the extended family, which means that you would have your mother, father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. You'd all live together. And usually the eldest male on your father's side would be the dominant person. So ladies, if you're listening, this means that your father's father would probably be the person responsible for choosing your husband if you were an American Indian. Let that fester for a minute on you. They tended to be farmers and small game hunters. Now, I know our image of the Indian is, these vicious natives out killing deer and killing buffalo, and they did do some of that. But let's be honest, it's really hard to kill a buffalo or a deer when your primary weapon is a stick with a sharpened stone on the end. Instead, what they ate usually was fish or rabbit or squirrel, rat in some places, whatever small game they could get. In the Northeast Woodlands, there was a group of Indians that united in what we call the League of the Iroquois. This was probably the first Indian confederation or massive Indian confederation. They had a written constitution. Why is that interesting to me? Well, because we know later on that Ben Franklin at our own constitutional convention will have a translation of at least part of the League of the Iroquois constitution, and we might have borrowed some of it for our own government. I find that to be at least interesting. We have another group of descendants of the mound builders, just like the Aztecs were. This group is called the civilized tribes. They're the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, Cherokees, and Creeks. And these 5 tribes were called civilized by the Europeans because they were the most like Europeans. They owned land, they farmed the land, they very quickly adopted Western clothing. They tried to adopt oftentimes the English language or the Spanish language in Spanish territories. They were friendly Indians, and we liked these guys. The single most civilizing thing to the British was that they tended to own slaves, if you could imagine that as being civilized. These guys are going to be the good Indians, at least for a while. Now, we're going to end up going to war against them later on, too. Way out in the American Southwest, West Texas, Arizona, Colorado, even up into Utah, we have the Pueblo Indians. There's 2 major groups, the Hopi and the Zuni. There's a bunch of small groups in between there. But they lived in these planned communities and what I'm going to call apartment-style pueblos. There's a picture down there at the bottom. These are mud brick houses. These were agricultural people, which is pretty impressive out in the desert. They would practice dry farming techniques, and they would bring the water down from the mountains through these hand-dug irrigation ditches. Very, very fancy systems here. Those pictures there are of Hopi Indians, but they're Hopi Indians about the mid-19th century, so the mid-1800s. But it kind of gives you a feel for what they were like. All right, this complex Amerindian society slide is going to be kind of important because I want you to kind of think about this. This is a slide that brings everything together. I want you to think about how that in southern Mexico and down in South America, they were much more complex. They were every bit as advanced as anywhere else in the world. Mathematically, they had the concept of zero. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but people insist to me that that's important in math. They also tell me that 0 and nothing are not the same thing. Again, history teacher, I'm not sure. They had hyper-accurate calendars. They developed irrigation systems, and their architecture was highly elaborate. They also lived in extended families. So if you were to get a lecture or an essay question about describe the red culture, this slide would be your key to be able to organize that. All right, so our snapshot day, 1492. We're going to look at each one of these cultures in 1492. And what did American Indian societies look like in 1492? Well, we know that they lived in diverse physical environments. We know that the woodland environments, the areas particularly in the northeast woodland areas, will support the largest populations. Why? Well, woodland environments have more food. It's just kind of common sense. We also know the native populations altered their environment as needed. One of the things they would use is slash and burn agriculture, where they would go around the trees and strip the bark off for about a 1 foot wide swath all the way around the tree. When the tree died and it would drop its branches, they would then stack those branches and leaves around the base of the trees and burn the land. It was an efficient and effective way to clear the land. However, it also means that large swaths of the American continent, when Columbus showed up here, had already been cleared. the Indians were not these great custodians of the land that we imagine they were. We know they also used cultural diffusion or cultural borrowing or maybe cultural sharing, whatever term, whatever term you like. But they traded ideas back and forth. We know this because we can find cases of things like seashells out in the American Southwest. How did the seashells get there? The fish didn't swim there, so there had to be some way to do this.